There was a monk debate recently entitled, Be It Resolved That the Mainstream Media Cannot Be Trusted. Unsurprisingly, the yay side won, and as a bonus, won by the largest margin of any monk debate in its entire 28-year history. That is a big deal. Monk debates are about as prestigious as Canada gets with regard to debates. Very well regarded. Troubling, though, is the fact that the debate was over whether or not the mainstream could be trusted in the Western world as a whole, not just in Canada. The idea that the Canadian media might be trustworthy generally hardly came up. And certainly nobody was foolish enough to suggest that it was trustworthy in its coverage of the Freedom Convoy, which the so called journalist insisted on calling the so called Freedom Convoy. Here's how Douglas Murray put it. The Canadian mainstream media acted as an amen chorus of the Canadian government, Murray argued. Now, why is this rancid? So utterly rancid and corrupt? Because in this country, your media, your mainstream media, is funded by the government. I've never talked to anyone from a currently authoritarian or formerly authoritarian country that heard that, just this fact, the amount of money that Trudeau gives to journalists, and didn't say, yeah, you're living under a tyranny now. Not a particularly brutal one yet, but yeah. Tyrants take control of the news media. And in his case, he did it using taxpayers' money. Anyway, a journalist from the nay side revealed a little more than she realized, I suspect, in her defense of the mainstream media when she said, I showed up at the Ottawa protest kind of expecting the sorts of things that I've seen at Donald Trump rallies, at various even further right events, and I didn't find it. I was really quite astonished. And I told my editors that this is what I found, and they said, great, that's more interesting than what we thought you were going to find. And it was more interesting. But that woman was working for the New York Times. So that statement is a defense of the New York Times, not the CBC or any Canadian mainstream publisher who tried to create the impression that the protests were dangerous. Check this. Pat Morris, supervisor of the Ontario Provincial Operations Intelligence Bureau, a guy who would know about the threats facing Canada, and in particular with regard to the trucker convoy, said that he found no credible intelligence of threats in terms of producing intelligence, and even said that the lack of violent crime was shocking in Ottawa, with only few charges laid for violent crimes, most of them against police officers. Morris also said he found it problematic to hear certain unidentified politicians and members of the media claim the protests were being influenced by Russian or American sources, or even former President Donald Trump, when he never saw proof of that. I have a little trouble with that quote because I don't know what he means by unidentified politicians. Maybe they just weren't identified in this testimony. Like they're lying, right? When the media is lying constantly, then you really know you have a problem. The lack of violence was shocking. That statement is in itself almost shocking. Presumably what he meant by that is that such a large group of protesters protesting over such a long period of time, he would have expected serious criminality to have occurred. That's not the impression we got from the mainstream media, though, is it? A compliant media that will do your lying for you, paid for by taxpayers who, generally speaking, hate you, must be any sadistic authoritarian's wet dream. I don't think that, I remember how angry people were at Stephen Harper, but I think that this is probably a lot worse. And it's a lot worse because it's a lot more justified. Imagine the situation that Canada would be in now if Stephen Harper had remained Prime Minister. We'd be a lot better off, especially economically. Here's how the member of European Parliament, Christine Anderson, described Trudeau's authoritarian nature to the European Parliament, the world, and to Trudeau himself in person. At this meeting that was set up for everyone to decide what to do about the Russian-Ukraine conflict, Trudeau was invited, and of course, he actually thinks that anybody would care what his opinion on how to deal with that situation would be. And there was three different members of the European Parliament who got up and lambasted him in this way. A prime minister who openly admires the Chinese basic dictatorship, who tramples on fundamental rights by persecuting and criminalizing his own citizens as terrorists, just because they dared to stand up to his perverted concept of democracy, should not be allowed to speak in this House at all. And I think that she went on to say, could you please spare us your presence? It's surprising how many people say truly horrific things like this about our Prime Minister. And many of the people you hear saying such things are past or current citizens of authoritarian regimes who understand that the totalitarian nature is sadistic to varying degrees, but it is always sadistic. Uh, Konstantin Kisin from Trigonometry. He was born in Russia, speaks Russian, and you could just check it out. What sort of opinion he has regarding Trudeau? John Anderson, the former Prime Minister of Australia. I, I mean, at this point, there's no point denying that a lot of very concerned and well-educated, intelligent people point to him as an example of woke authoritarianism. This happens all the time. So where's the defense? Uh, Generally speaking, people on the left don't really want to debate, so they wouldn't want to get into it. There would be people on my side, Justin Trudeau is a woke authoritarian. Be it resolved. Let's have a debate. They'd be lined up all over the place on the side that thinks that he is, and nobody would bother on the other side. Number one, because they're wrong, and number two, because they don't agree. They don't want to be involved in a debate, because the debate is about finding the truth. It's about using critical thinking and logic and good reasoning to arrive at some sort of a truth claim. That's not what they're concerned with doing. They're concerned with pushing a narrative. Whether or not it has any connection to reality or not is not the point. Okay, so to me, the totalitarian instinct is always about cruelty. But there's a Christian intellectual, C.S. Lewis, who conceived of it differently. And this really gets to the heart of it. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, and yet are, at the same time, likelier to make a hell on earth. So that's, let's say the policy with regards to drug addiction. So they come at that with the attitude that they're being compassionate, but actually are they? Because we've seen 20 years of this, right? And what's the result? So are these compassionate people? It makes you question, are they compassionate in the first place? Are they motivated by a desire to do good and just make the mistake of behaving like authoritarians in the process? And I'm coming to the conclusion more and more that they're not. They don't even have good intentions. The people that are involved in drug treatment and all of that sort of thing, they're speculating on this, theorizing about that, dreaming up these policies, want to see a continuation of the problem so they can remain employed. Honestly, that's what I think. I wish that wasn't the case. It's a horrible situation when you get to the point where you think, no, I don't think these people even have good intentions. Okay, so so C.S. Lewis is speaking of the nanny state, of course, though he would have been writing before we saw the nanny state. It's just an interesting quote from the Financial Post. We see him here, we see him there, we see him damn near everywhere. Justin Trudeau has got to have Canada's biggest carbon footprint, do you think? Since May 1st, by calculations based on his official daily itinerary and an internet distance between 2 points app, he has flown more than 38,000 kilometers. That's just 2,000 kilometers less than the Earth's circumference. Around the world in 38 days, they could make a movie, and boy, would that be a good movie. If someone were to take his life story seriously and make a movie out of it, with all of the absurdities involved, the ridiculousness, the serious damage that he's done, that could be a brilliant movie. Now we're finally on to the Emergencies Act itself. Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act was unjustified, and only through a perverse and corrupt interpretation of events and laws could anyone argue otherwise, for reasons that I'll try to outline, beginning with the most obvious, which is that the Emergencies Act is the strongest power that the government has for depriving Canadians, however temporarily, of their fundamental rights and freedoms. So if you have an extraordinary power, then you have to have an extraordinary justification for it. I mean, it's straight up was unjustified. Both conventional wisdom and the Act say that it should only be used when an emergency seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and cannot be effectively dealt with under any law of Canada. Okay, according to CSIS Director David Vigneault, our highest level security organization, no such threat existed, and he made a point out of it by telling the cabinet this himself. This has been a cornerstone of critics' accusation that the threshold had not been met, because the CSIS director had said that it wasn't met. Then towards the end of the public hearings, when things were going very badly indeed for the Liberals, it was claimed that Vigneault had, in a private meeting, told Trudeau that he would be justified in invoking the Act, and it was advised to proceed. Sorry, I have a bit of a raspy throat. That strains credulity. If such a conversation had actually taken place, the Liberal government would have had nothing to lose and everything to gain from revealing it to the public, because it would have helped justify the Act from the beginning of the hearings, the committee hearings and the commission. Right? We're looking into whether or not he was justified in invoking it. The story now is that the CSIS director told him that he was justified, though he didn't tell anybody else, and Trudeau didn't share that information until the end of the hearing. Explain that. The public had a right to that information. The fact that it came out after months of committee testimony and weeks of commission testimony is extremely suspicious. To my knowledge, no explanation has been provided to explain that curious state of affairs, and no questions have been asked. Nobody's asking about that. Here's another curious thing. David Lametti claimed that there was a body of legal opinion that supported the broader interpretation of the Emergencies Act used by the Liberals. Fair enough. That would be useful, but when asked to share those opinions, Lametti refused, claiming solicitor-client privilege. I don't know what it is. I look at the phrase solicitor-client, right? Client has the L after the C, and somehow it pollutes my pronunciation of the previous word. We are therefore being asked to accept a legal opinion with no reason given for it. The very least that Lametti could have provided would have been the relevant literature. Short of that, it is reasonable to assume that the literature does not exist, or that it does not say what he claims that it says. So Lametti is claiming that there's a legal interpretation that goes towards them being justified in invoking the Act, but won't give us the interpretation. I'm going to start calling these dizzy moments. They keep producing these dizzy moments. You hear it, but you can't wrap your head around it. And it happens all the time with these people. And I see it on the faces of people when I talk to them. They're talking about this situation or that situation, and their brains just sort of give up. They've been wrestling with these absurdities for so long that they're at the end of their rope. Okay, even the NDP is suspicious. Solicitor-client privilege is indeed an important principle, but under the statutes governing inquirers in other jurisdictions, is it is at times clearly spelled out that professional secrecy cannot be invoked as a shield to stop the commission from getting all the evidence that it needs. Otherwise, why hold the inquiry at all? The legality of the government's action was the crux of what Rouleau had to decide, and Lametti was being singularly unhelpful. And that's from none other than the great Tom Mulcair. I don't happen to like, but I do respect his intelligence. No police force, including the Ottawa police, had asked for the invocation, presumably because they had been working with the Freedom Convoy for weeks to keep the protests safe. That's how it had been kept safe. The truckers and the police had been in communication from the beginning. And they had a good idea how to bring the protest to a peaceful end. Trucks had already begun moving out of the residential areas before the act was invoked. And let's keep in mind that the truckers had a staging area outside the city where they had planned a protest. And it was government officials that sent them downtown. Don't forget that. That was either a screw up or it was intended to create a mess, or who knows. But originally the protesters had not planned to go into the residential areas or the area in front of the Parliament buildings. It wasn't their intention. But they had begun moving out. And all it took to get to that point was for Ottawa to send a negotiator who later said that the protests were pacified simply by having someone, anyone, in a position of influence listen to them, something the Liberals steadfastly refused to do. In the days preceding, the police, having seen the success that Ottawa had achieved through dialogue, had a plan to increase the number of liaison officers to open up channels of communication and begin a process of negotiation and reconciliation. Trudeau rejected the plan to deploy more liaison officers, calling it no plan at all. Which is curious because he advised people to read the plan, but also claimed to have not read it himself. When the plan was made available to the Commission, it was highly redacted, which means that we will never be able to see for ourselves the plan that he rejected, having never read it himself. Okay, it's another dizzy moment, isn't it? The refusal to engage the protesters, the insults, and the invocation itself seemed designed specifically to provoke a violent reaction. Okay, so I know that people are commenting on this kind of thing all the time, and I just want to put forward something a little bit original anyway, and I believe this too. I think that the entire time he was trying to provoke a violent reaction, which would have been extremely dangerous for the people of Ottawa. In the commission hearings, he said that he supported protests, but not protests that demanded change, which is curious because he supported protests in Iran and China which demanded change. When BLM protested in front of the Parliament, he literally got on one knee to express solidarity with the cause. You have to wonder about an organization that views an act of supplication, which is how a lot of people would regard getting down on your knee, as an act of solidarity, especially when that organization helped cause riots that negatively impacted black communities across the United States. BLM was a tragedy for black people in the States, but Trudeau got on his knees for that movement. For the truckers, he had only insults. So we've got our woke prime minister getting on his knees, supplicating himself to an organization that caused all kinds of damage. I'm going to get around to the notion that not only do they know what they're doing, not only do they know how much anger that they're causing, but that's the reason that they do it. George Orwell said, the purpose of torture is torture. So we're wondering, they're involved in censorship and propaganda and lawsuits come down on people, and they're corrupting the media. All of these things that authoritarians do. And the problem with authoritarians is not just that, but that it eventually leads to imprisonment, torture, and murder. And the point that I want to make, I think that's a little bit new, is that they know that they're torturing us with this. They know that that's torture to anybody with a brain in their head. And if they don't know that they're torturing people with this sort of nonsense, then they're incredibly, I'll say the word stupid. You would have to be stupid not to understand how a lot of this sort of behavior, people hear about what's going on and their minds are tortured. So as authoritarians, they've already moved into the torture phase. What they want as sadists is to torture people, and they're already enjoying that. That's what I'm saying. Comparison with Aboriginal protesters. The statues were tied with ropes and hauled to the ground during a demonstration over the deaths of Indigenous children at residential schools. The statue of Queen Victoria, larger and placed prominently near the main entrance to the legislature grounds, had its head removed. The head was recovered the next day from the nearby Assiniboine River. A smaller statue of Queen Elizabeth, located close to the Lieutenant Governor's residence, was toppled but left largely intact. So Queen Elizabeth died after they had ripped down her statue. How is it that nobody put it together and said, you see the outpouring of grief from around the world at the death of this monarch? So how does that jive with a situation where Aboriginal protesters, they look mostly white to me, and at that event there were more police than protesters. They could have stopped it. So the police allowed them to rip down this statue. Why wasn't that? That's an obvious thing to point out. It's interesting. Let's recall that to date not a single body has been exhumed. Let's also recall that during the time that the residentials were open, most of the medical advances that keep people alive today did not exist. Canada experienced 2 world wars, a major economic depression, and, like the rest of the world, the Spanish flu. And, you know, the really obscene thing about it is that Aboriginal people in that area always knew that there was a graveyard somewhere. There had to be. People die. What is the utopian notion that you're going to live in a world that people don't die? 68 Christian churches in Canada have been vandalized, burned down, or desecrated since the announcement last month of the apparent discovery of graves found near a residential school in Kamloops. It wasn't discovered, it was located. The Aboriginal people knew it was there. That news about those graves went around the world. It shapes the way that people view Canada. It's the first thing they hear, they'll stick with this. It'll be really hard to change their mind later. You could present people with any sort of argument, but people go with the first thing they hear. In response to these announcements, far-left radicals have used this opportunity as an excuse to terrorize Catholic and other Christian communities by targeting churches. 25 churches across the country have been lit on fire in the past 2 months. Many of them have been completely destroyed. Okay, here's the transcript from a committee hearing in which CSIS was questioned about not including Aboriginal activists in its 2021 threat assessment. It was provided by True North and contains some commentary from them. Officials with CSIS also refused to give a straight answer as to why the church burnings were not including it in its 2021 threat assessment report. These are the people that are responsible for the security of Canada. They prepared the report and didn't mention what happened to these churches. I just find it interesting because you do have extensive stuff in your report about ideologically motivated extremism, religiously motivated extremism, politically motivated extremism, And yet 30 churches being burned down in Canada last year didn't merit a mention. That's from, I don't know the guy's first name, is Lloyd, I believe he's a Conservative MP. And this was in committee hearing. If you're not listening to the committee hearing, you don't know what's happening in Canadian politics. I would say it's just as simple as that. Because the committee hearings are the place where finally our representatives have an opportunity to ask questions and where they're expected to give an answer. Although even in committee hearings, they don't. This guy's garage has them out. So he says, can you tell us if CSIS has ever reached out to show support and solidarity with the 30 church communities that were burned down in Canada in 2021? Which CSIS responded, what I will say is that the service is always extremely concerned, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, no, they didn't. Lloyd responded with reference to the Morinville church fire, which saw the Alberta community's century-old Catholic church burned down in June. In the middle of the biggest, most dangerous heat wave in Canadian history. It would be nice to have the statement of at least concern for those communities from CSIS, considering the fact that at 4 a.m. in the morning in my hometown of Morinville, over 50 people had to be evacuated from their homes because a church was burned down. And there was a massive threat that a seniors' home apartment was going to be burned to the ground, and probably with Aboriginal people in it. And I don't think that there's any investigation into who lit those fires. I don't think so. You could check it, but I don't think there is one. This could have been one of the highest mass casualty terrorist events on Canadian soil in our modern history. And yet it doesn't seem to have merited a single mention by your security service. So I want to put that on record. I've focused a lot on the situation with Aboriginal people in these 3 little, whatever you call these things, lectures, I suppose. And I focused a lot on the Aboriginal issues, and that's because I think that that's where we're headed for a lot of problems, really a lot of problems. Anyway, recall that many of these churches were well loved, and some were the most beautiful buildings in town, probably, right? Once again, activists fighting for Aboriginal causes negatively affected Aboriginal people. Quite often the way that it works, these woke initiatives end up hurting the people that they claim to be fighting for. They did manage to increase the level of fear in the country, however, and fear is a great way to destroy social cohesion and provoke hatred and conflict. Conflict increases the chances of political violence, and violence, especially in the absence of reasonable debate, frequently necessitates repressive measures. In their imagine, the left would be the instigators of that repression and not the victims, obviously. This is what authoritarians do. They create conflict in order to stand up for one side. And that's how they gain power. It's the oldest trick in the book, divide and conquer. At some point, Canadians are going to have to take seriously the fact that they're stuck between cultural Marxist universities and radical Aboriginal activists, often white, who are willing, for example, to go on an arson spree during the worst heat wave in Canadian history, and in response to slanderous news articles claiming in the beginning that a mass grave had been discovered. That's an incredible slander against our country. I wonder how does a country sue? Article claiming that a mass grave had been discovered when in fact what had happened was that a grave site had been located, one that Aboriginal people had always known existed. The graveyard had been open for decades through the Great Depressions, World Wars I, II, Spanish flu, and operated for much of its time before many of the most important medical advances had been made. Of course there was a graveyard. They didn't even listen to the Aboriginal people. And the activists didn't listen to the rank and file Aboriginal people when they decided to bring the Canadian rail system to its knees to protest the pipeline that most Aboriginal people wanted in that territory. That went on for 6 weeks. How can a country be so ridiculous as to allow that sort of a protest against the project that the affected Aboriginal people wanted. And that the whole thing was initiated by a guy who was actually trying to take over the matrilineal uh, leadership position, despite the fact that he's a guy. You look into it, see what happened there. That is what happened. And then he went into cahoots with probably the most radical Aboriginal activists in the country. This is crazy. Western political philosophy is predicted on the supremacy of individual rights over collective rights because the pursuit of collective rights leads to conflict and is intended to. This group gets this, the other doesn't, and based on identity. Aboriginal people, and I imagine that some of this will be um, hard to hear for people, and in some cases, I'm not concerned about that. If somebody finds it difficult to hear that, Canada was behaved so ridiculously by allowing those rail strikes to continue for 6 weeks, that's too bad for them. But here's something that I can see Aboriginal people might find offensive. But I'm going to say it anyway. And do you know why? Because I think it's the truth. Aboriginal people are being colonized again, this time by cultural Marxists coming out of the education system. They want to encourage Aboriginal people to at least appreciate that they were colonized by a country that gave us democracy and the rule of law. Colonization is the way of the world. It's always happened. And I know that this could sound the wrong way, but in point of actual fact, Aboriginals were really fortunate that they were colonized by a country that respected individual rights. And not, how long would the world have gone on developing its technologies before somebody would come and do that? They're lucky it wasn't the Chinese. They're lucky it wasn't the Spanish. England gave the world democracy and the rule of law, representative government, universal suffrage, eventually, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, the right to a fair trial, and the presumption of innocence, both threatened in sexual assault cases. Barbara Kay has an article about that. They gave us representative government. In other words, the right to participate in your own governance. You can talk about politics and you can vote. Independence of the judiciary, violated by Trudeau. Freedom of speech, obviously under threat. Parental rights, under threat. I think that parental rights should include the right to know whether or not your school has decided to allow your child to live as the opposite sex. Wouldn't the parents have the right to know that their kid had made that decision? And schools keep that secret. It's another one of those dizzy moments. You don't quite know how to respond to something as insane as that. I mean, there might be the cases where there's abusive parents and, it might be advisable not to tell the parents, but if you're not going to tell the parents, perhaps you should advise the kid to tone it down a bit. They don't have good intentions. They want to screw the kid up, and they don't care if they're screwing the parents up. I'm at that point. I don't see that these people have good intentions anymore. Even though I'm sure that some of them do. I'm starting to lean towards the conclusion that they don't. What kind of a exercise of power is it to be able to confuse the identity of children with their parents not having any ability to do anything about it? The purpose of torture is torture. And the purpose of authoritarianism is to give you the power to conduct that torture. The British gave us the right to bodily autonomy and informed consent, which is, in the current situation, pretty interesting. the right to bodily autonomy and informed consent. You can't give informed consent if you weren't given the information. Freedom of movement, freedom of association. These things did not happen by accident, and Aboriginal people are rightful heirs to all of this and the scientific method and all that that is provided, especially food and medical care. I'm going to provide a quote from the second most important conservative philosopher probably of all time, Roger Scruton. And what he advises people is to look at anything that you have that's good in your society and to understand that that thing is more easily destroyed than it is created, especially if what you're looking at is something that came together because of the cooperation of, in this case, millions of people produced these democratic institutions. You had to have, there had to be a clarity of purpose shared by enough people to bring these things into being. If you destroy that thing, good luck getting it back. Good luck getting your freedom of expression back. Your bodily autonomy, your parental rights, your freedom of movement. They don't come back easily. The world's default position is authoritarianism. And from the beginning of the democratic process, it was understood, especially as it grew in the United States, that you're not going to maintain it without serious struggle. You're pushing against human nature probably, which is to, some people want to be told what to do. They don't want to have any decisions to make. They want life as easy as possible. And there's other people that like to push people around. And if you go slack, that's what you get. So with Aboriginal people, I'd like to put forward another idea, and I'm sure a lot of them would find this completely insulting. But I don't, in this case, I don't care. I don't care. Because I think it would be good for Aboriginal people. So not only do I think this is the truth, I think that it's good. The conservative philosopher said that it used to be commonplace that we would think of truth, goodness, and beauty as being something that really should go together. So I'm not arguing that this is a beautiful idea, but I will say that it's what I'm going after here is truth and goodness. So check this out. This is different. Let's say we turn this whole thing on its head and argue that Aboriginal people claim their full inheritance as citizens of Canada. Aboriginal people speak English, live under a British-style parliamentary legal system, enjoy the privilege of a Canadian passport, and have access to a variety of social services. Why does there seem to be no push to encourage them to claim the other aspect of their identity? Wouldn't it maybe be an idea for them to study how difficult democracy was to achieve? What it was going to mean if it's lost? It's criminal that isn't encouraged, that it isn't regular practice. What if instead of going to another class on Aboriginal this, Aboriginal that, what if some of them had the opportunity to visit Europe, go to museums, study Western art and philosophy, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the scientific method, critical thinking? Most importantly, they should be taught what a precious and fragile thing democracy is. They need to know what it is, how hard it was to achieve, and what the consequences will be if it's lost. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be studying Aboriginal history and Aboriginal culture. Of course not. There's a lot to be learned from that. But there's a lot to be learned from, I guess, from European culture, I guess you'd have to say it. It's truly profound, magnificent stuff. It is almost criminal that this is not taught more in schools. And I think that might be because the main purpose of democracy is to keep individuals free of coercive control, being themselves the ones that want to exercise that cruel, coercive power. They would rather that that did not get out. So back to Roger Scruton, probably the second most influential conservative intellectuals who has ever lived, second only to Edmund Burke, once said that at the core of conservatism is love for things as they are. How many think of it as being primarily about love now? Conservatives themselves seem not to mention that themselves anymore. Perhaps they should. The left, in its typical fashion, gets it precisely wrong by assuming that it's all about hate. From Roger Scruton, conservatism starts from a sentiment that all mature people can share, the sentiment that good things are easily destroyed, but not easily created. Here's another one from Roger. By living in a spirit of forgiveness, and this has got to be something that you can claim is lacking from all of them, from the transgender groups, from the gay rights groups, from the feminist groups, from all of that. They don't talk about forgiveness. They've got all the bad characteristics of religion and none of the good ones. Anyway, by living in a spirit of forgiveness, we not only uphold the core value of citizenship, but also find the path to social membership that we need. I think that here what he's suggesting is that as long as you're complaining, you're not going to really feel at home. Which doesn't mean that people shouldn't stand up for their rights and talk about past injustices. But at some point, somebody's going to have to ask the question, when has it been enough? Happiness does not come from the pursuit of pleasure, nor is it guaranteed by freedom. It comes from sacrifice. That is the message of the Christian religion, and it is the message that is conveyed by all the memorable works of our culture. It is the message that has been lost in the noise of repudiation, but which it seems to me can be heard once again if we devote our energies to retrieving it. And in the Christian tradition, the primary act of sacrifice is forgiveness. So you've got all of these woke identity groups, and at some point, we have to be free to talk about the damage that they've done, right? And so then at that point, it's not a question of them forgiving us. It's whoever us and them is. It's a question of us forgiving them. This is coming from Christianity, which is quite awkward because I was once a legitimately vociferous critic of religion in general, and by that I mean I was a mean troll on the internet. A great fan of Hitchens, Harris, and Dawkins, I had a lot to work with. Religious groups are notoriously prone, for example, to the sexual abuse of children, and not just under the Catholic faith. Tibetan monks were worse. Woke educators have now picked up the mantle. Do a search for inappropriate things being taught in school. I mean, there's examples where people have gone to the school board meetings and read aloud the material that was being taught to their 10-year-olds and had the school board say, no, you can't do that here because it's obscene. So, I mean, people are really angry about this stuff in the United States. And I wish that woman had the presence of mind to say, well, it's too obscene for a school board meeting. Why in hell are you teaching it to kids in school? Anyway, religions cause problems. And what we've got now is a woke religion. The only thing it is missing is the supernatural element. Religions cause wars, limit human progress. But how does that fit with the wisdom of the passages above about the importance of forgiveness or the gift of human rights that Christianity laid the foundation for? It doesn't. I did my time studying what residential schools did to Aboriginal people, and it was horrifying. I understand that there's a legitimate complaint. Anyway, Welcome to the world of complexity and paradox. I have to ask you though, would you rather kids in school were studying and debating this kind of thing, the importance of forgiveness, or whatever it is that causes them to shut down rail lines, burn down churches in the middle of an extremely dangerous heat wave, attack construction crews, deface and rip down monuments of our queens and founding fathers? There's this push to rename everything with Aboriginal names. That's problematic because number one, Canada's filled with Aboriginal names already. It's all over the place. I think it's something like 50% of place names in Canada are Aboriginal. I believe Canada's itself is an Aboriginal word. And then added to that, another one of these dizzy moments where they've concocted a script that nobody's going to be able to read. And the fact that a lot of these languages aren't really even spoken by anybody really. So you're being presented with a script that you can't find the pronunciation from, and that you're going to have a hard time writing into a computer. And you get dizzy again. How could anybody be that stupid? And you have to appreciate too that changing these place names, putting pride flags all over the place. You can't go outside without, another Black Power Month or Black History Month. I think it's Black History Month in Canada right now. In a sense, what they're doing is they're claiming a territory, especially with the flags. That's what conquering armies do, is they plant flags. Now we've got them everywhere, on police cars. What do we need pride flags on police cars for? Are Aboriginal people really so well advised to join this new woke religion that seems to have picked up all the negatives of religion, but none of the wisdom, humility, I'm really sorry about this, wisdom, humility, love, or forgiveness? It comes complete with rituals, for example, land acknowledgements, blasphemy laws, speech codes, and harsh treatment of apostates, cancel culture. It's the ones that jump ship that really get it. Like if you've had transgender surgery and have come to regret it, and you start speaking out, the trans community will attack you viciously. This woke religion demands that people pay for the indoctrination, and some would argue sexual abuse of their own children. Having such recent experience with the Catholic Church, I would imagine that some are very concerned about what is happening in school. A little later, we're going to have a look at the video Sex Junk by Rachel Bloom. That was produced for school-age children. This isn't just perverse. It is intended, and this, I'm going to say this again, it is intended to create a violent response. How could they think anything else? Like, are they really so stupid? Wait till you hear what Sex Junk is about. Are they so stupid as to imagine that people wouldn't feel really angry and hurt and frightened by that? I don't think they're that stupid. They're trying to create a violent response in order to repress it and win votes from people who also want to see repression, especially if it flatters and profits them. At bottom, authoritarianism is about the subjugation of people, the transfer of wealth, and the status and power that comes with it. It is doubly sad that race is such an issue in it, because it doesn't seem to be on the ground. Canada is a warm and hospitable country, and most immigrants are adventuresome, hardworking, often highly educated, and warm and hospitable too. Multiculturalism can be a very dangerous thing. Look at what happened in Yugoslavia, for example, or between Muslims and Hindus in India, or the growing tension between Hindus and Sikhs in India. Multiculturalism is dangerous. But in Canada, that does not seem to be the case, thanks to both Canadians and immigrants themselves. For a lot of people, but perhaps mostly European Canadians, the question at the back of their minds must be, where does it end? When have we made enough apologies, paid enough compensation, absorbed enough, for example, Aboriginal art into our public spaces, and now endured too many cases of arson, desecration, and removal of monuments. Likewise, likewise, when will we have too many pride parades, pride months? How many is too many gay flags staking out territory? This February is Black Pride Month. Like, is this never going to end? Is there any point at which we can start congratulating ourselves for the country that we've created and quit the nagging? I don't think so, because there's too many people are making too much money off of it. It flatters their ego. Nah, it won't end unless there's a pushback. And at this time, European Canadians are not doing so well. We're relatively old, are not having enough children, and a really high percentage of us are not doing well financially. They're homeless, alcoholic, drug addicted. In the neighborhood that I live in, I see that all the time. It would be really easy to start thinking of white people as something less in my neighborhood, because my neighborhood happens to be filled with so many alcoholic and drug addicted white people. Our history is denigrated in schools, and we're becoming racial minorities in our own communities. So the people that push racial issues, they're not wrong about everything, right? And one of the things that they're not wrong about is that it can be really uncomfortable to be a racial minority. But if European Canadians complain about that, of course, there's something wrong with it for some reason. Marginalized communities, the gay rights people, the transgendered, all of this, use the principle and practice of free speech and the right to equal opportunity to lift themselves up. But the radicals among them want to pull that ladder up, and frequently with the encouragement of white people themselves. There's not that many white people that would criticize affirmative action programs, for example. Here's another quote from Roger Scruton. The disposition in any conflict to side with them against us, and the felt need to denigrate the customs, culture, and institutions that are identifiably ours. So this is weird. Usually in a conflict, there's them and us. But we're the only ones who, in the conflict, identify with them. Being the opposite of xenophobia, I propose to call this state of mind oikophobia, by which I mean, stretching the Greek a little, the repudiation of inheritance and home. Where did that come from? Well, that came, there's an answer from the slow march through the institutions that cultural Marxists attempted to accomplish. They thought that by attacking the institutions that provide individuals with freedom from government coercion, freedom from dependence on the state, if they could eliminate that from people's lives, then they could finally assume the authoritarian position that they deserve. So they attack everything. They attack the binary, between male and female. They attack the church. They attack the family. They attack freedom of expression. They attack all of the basic principles such as equality of opportunity, freedom of movement, freedom of association, etc. Okay, here's something that bugs me too. Most government hate speech takes the form of accusations of racist harassment. Curious then that neither the CBC, CTV, Global News, the Liberal Party, the police, nor private citizens have little to no footage of such harassment, and I'm speaking now of within the Freedom Convoy. What does exist is hundreds of hours of live stream of that event, often showing a diverse range of people working together for a common cause. Those videos would be a good place to find incidents of racist attacks that have been reported on so broadly. Prominent and pervasive, as one official put it. So why then were the wokies not out there capturing evidence and stopping a crime? And I can tell you, our guys would do that. If that kind of thing was happening within the convoy, our guys would have put an end to it. And I saw an example of it. That's one thing I have seen video evidence of. Victims or neighbors and friends of victims could have captured it, and we could use that footage to catch the culprits. Liberal supporters, unless they're cowards and hypocrites, would have been on it trying to record as much as possible, as would the victims, as would journalists. These kinds of videos would probably be worth quite a lot of money and perhaps help with the journalist's career. They could have delivered those videos to the police. Did that happen? No. Claims of pervasive racial abuse would have certainly helped the citizens of Ottawa, some of whom are launching a $300 million lawsuit against the convoy. For that kind of money, you would think somebody would have bothered to collect examples. So, without video, it's reasonable to assume that they're exaggerated out of all proportion, or that they're simply lying. A lot of people who attend the protest remarked that it was very diverse and friendly. At one point, an Aboriginal drum group led the protests in a rousing rendition of O Canada. How poignant is that? Why wasn't it on the CBC? I'm emphasizing this because accusations of racism are one of the main strategies the Liberals and other groups use to stoke fear, hatred, anger, and division in Canada, the country that accepts more immigrants than any other country in the world. It has been used to limit Canadians' right to equal opportunity in employment and education through diversity, inclusion, and equity laws. And just to add injury to insult, and throughout the epidemic, the federal government, in its wisdom, went on a furious hiring spree, and no doubt under die principles. So we're headed into a recession, massively in debt. They increase immigration and at the same time go on a wild spending spree, hiring all kinds of employees who are going to do what? They buy votes, they buy influence, and they bought influence with CERB money from extremely wealthy people. The billionaires in Canada through the epidemic saw a 50% rise in wealth. Again, the purpose of torture is torture, George Orwell. Orwell's quote is good, but standing out of context from his masterpiece 1984. It stands like one piece of a triangle with the other two missing. And the other two are sadism and authoritarianism. Sadism is the goal of authoritarianism, and torture is how the sadism manifests. We are not being tortured like the victims of the past, but it's where we're going. Google it, what Chinese and Russian communists did, what communists are doing now to people in North Korea, what socialists have done to Venezuela. That hasn't got to that point, but a lot of us certainly feel that we're being tortured psychologically. For example, it's torture knowing that step-parents are 100 times more likely to abuse children than biological parents. That's torture to contemplate. And it's torture to contemplate that in a situation where there are members of our population who see marriage as an essentially exploitive arrangement. Canada has no laws regarding abortion. None. I think the only two other countries that have none are China and North Korea. It's torture that you feel afraid to talk about your legitimate concerns. It's torture knowing that our country is doing almost nothing about the sudden increase in teenage girls experiencing sudden onset gender dysphoria. But it didn't exist 5 minutes ago. Girls suddenly realizing that they should be the opposite sex now outnumber boys. Nothing for thousands of years, and then pop, suddenly we see this as a big problem. Up go those numbers of confused girls getting their breasts cut off. Do you wonder what's causing it? Could it be the transgender kindergarten drag shows or all of the rest of it? From the promise that educators won't tell your parents if you change your name to Joe from Jane? Parents are overrated, right? We're the ones who will really take care of you, teach you about all the different genders and sexualities. We're here to open up a new world of fun and friendship. And often to people who are slightly autistic, not fitting in, having a really difficult time with adolescence. So here's Sex Junk by Rachel Bloom. This was designed, well, it was presented to school-aged kids. This one goes out to all my bipeds who identify as ladies. That's how it went. This world of ours is full of choice, but must I choose between only John or Joyce? So she's accepted, you know, you can choose John, you can choose Joyce, but aren't there other options? Like what? And then I'm afraid that if I were to read too much of this, it might be considered objectionable. But I mean, this is commonplace. So this is designed for kids. She says, power bottom or a top off. I don't know what that means. Versatile love may have some butt stuff. I'm down for anything. Don't box in my box. Give someone new a handy, then give yourself props. You know, sexuality is a spectrum. Everyone is on it. Even you might like it if you sit up on it. I mean, you know, there's no question that's the sort of stuff being presented to children. Anyway, if you're not convinced that a lot of us feel literally tortured, might I suggest doing a poll? 10, 20 questions, each to be rated on a scale of 1 to 10 to great level of agreement. I mean, I'm joking, but this actually might be an idea. How many people feel tortured by the following facts? That there's a rising incidence of sudden onset gender dysphoria in females in particular, and in children in general. The people who provide transgender surgeries are gearing up to make a lot of money. And they're doing that at the same time that, like, for example, the Tavistock clinic in England has 1,000 lawsuits against it. Tavistock does cross-gender surgeries and has been doing them willy-nilly. And now they're getting sued for it. And these lawsuits are going to pile up. Here's one from a man named Voltaire. Those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. If you can be made to believe that, you know, such a high percentage of kids are actually transgender, if it can get you to believe that, then you can commit an atrocity, such as removing a teenage girl's breasts. Look at the surgeries, what it involves for a woman to become a man or a man to become a woman. And I would recommend to anybody Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Schreier. Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. It certainly provides evidence of atrocities committed by people who believe in absurdities. Not all people who menstruate are female. That's from a woman named Sandra Feiss, Minnesota State Representative, when discussing the possibility of putting menstrual products in boys' bathrooms. They want to put menstrual products in boys' bathrooms. I'm having another dizzy moment. Just ask people if the sight of our Prime Minister hurts their soul. Like, rather than the anger, let's think a little bit about the pain. That's, I think, something that people are missing. The $1.5 trillion federal debt. That's the federal debt. Then there's the provincial debt. Then there's the municipal debt. Then there's mortgage debt and debt on non-mortgage related things. I When I did the calculation uh, earlier, and you could do it yourself, uh, it was somewhere well over how much was it? Perhaps I should go back and look at it, but it was around $3 trillion. And if you see an increase on the interest rate, which was caused quite a lot by Trudeau's overspending, then you get an idea how much money is being wasted, just wasted. It was somewhere north of $140 billion a year that could have been spent on, for example, uh, environmental protection, education, all the rest of it. How many people feel tortured by the constant race baiting? And I don't include just white people amongst that. I have a lot of opportunity to talk to people of color, and they're sick of it too, because it makes them look like whiny, overly critical Karens. You know, I know black guys and I know guys from India, and they don't like it. Okay, ask people if they feel tortured by the destruction of monuments and the burning of churches. The children with no father at home. That's largely a product of feminism, and feminism is a wokey issue. Are they tortured by the propagandist mainstream media? I am. I mean, if I turn on the CBC and watch it, it's just one racial issue after another racial issue. Uh, it's just constant. Are we tortured by Trudeau's extravagances? The struggle so many men find, the struggle so many men are going through finding a place in the world right now. Their skills aren't as valued as they used to be because the marketplace has changed. To succeed now, it's really important that you're good at multitasking, and women are better at that than men are. And they're also constantly berated for toxic masculinity and mansplaining, which are real phenomenons. But what's the opposite? What's toxic femininity? Jordan Peterson's talking about it. Toxic femininity, the most destructive form comes in the form of what was it called? The destructive mother? I'm sorry, I've forgotten the devouring mother. And what he's saying is that, what Freud said is that the devouring mother doesn't allow children to grow up. It infantilizes them. And so that's one of the aspects of femininity that's toxic. And so what he's saying is that what you have in universities and the public education system just in general is dominated by women and gay people, that they don't have their own kids to devour, so they're devouring other people's kids with the safe spaces and the cancel culture and all of the rest. They're infantilizing them. University should be a place where you learn to hear and accept criticism, and where you think that criticism is unfair, to respond to it. That's the purpose of university, to create people who can engage rationally in a civil debate, and who aren't so sensitive that they're going to have their feelings hurt every time that they encounter a different opinion. The universities, to the extent that they are not producing people like that, they're failing. And Jordan didn't mention this, but what better way to infantilize someone, to prevent them from maturing, than by depriving them of their fertility? It's when people have kids that they grow up, or not. But there's a good argument to be made that what they're doing is they're sterilizing gay kids, because a lot of the gay kids, I think it's like 80 or 90%, who think they're transgender when they're young, grow on to become gay adults. But so what are these people doing? They're sterilizing the gay people. Are people tortured by the increasing number of addicted homeless people, mostly men and largely white? Just go have a look at it for yourself. Go look at who's homeless. It'll be mostly white men and a lot of white women as well. And you can ask, does woke insanity in general hurt you in your good place? And it's important to emphasize in your good place. Because the wicked thing is that Trudeau and his more intelligent woke followers know perfectly well is how much they hurt us. Or are they so out of touch with reality that they think men would not, and or women, would not be tortured by the thought of doctors cutting women's breasts off? They can't imagine that we would be the founding descendants of the most open country in the world and constantly being called racist while being discriminated against in employment and education. You could no more have a die policy without discrimination than you can have a husband without a wife. It's the blatantness that gets to them, the refusal to get out of faces. The discomfort this stuff causes is the purpose, or as Orwell would put it, the purpose of torture is torture. Don't let the overblown nature of this last few minutes rant put you off. If we don't understand the sadistic nature of these censors, compelling speech, these people out to ruin your life at the slightest provocation. How many people have been canceled for expressing legitimate concerns? If you don't understand that sadism is at the core of it, then you don't understand the nature of the beast, and that's dangerous to not understand it. And yes, it can be torture to sit through yet another land acknowledgement in public institutions, like a sermon from a religion you never agreed to join. And this is one, like, people don't criticize land acknowledgements much. You see some, but not much. Recently, our first Aboriginal Governor General and her entourage got in a bit of a spot of trouble over a $1.1 million bill she turned in for an 8-day trip to the Middle East. And I really like her. What is her name? Anyway, I should have included that. Anyway, I actually really like her. No doubt she's preferable to Julie Payette, the Governor General, who took it upon herself to criticize religious belief in public, and then went on to abuse her staff. Here's what Julie said about religious people. We're still debating and still questioning whether life was a divine intervention or whether it was coming out of a natural process, let alone, oh my goodness, lo and behold, random process. The problem with that, there's a lot of problems with that, but one of them being that her position is a symbolic one. She's the representative of the Queen, who in our tradition gains her power from the church. You might not be happy with that state of affairs, but to move into that position and then to reject its basis is just, again, another dizzy moment. It makes you dizzy. How could a person do that? And her role is symbolic. She's supposed to be impartial on everything. But she went on to abuse staff. It's just perfectly symbolic. Hire someone on an affirmative action basis who goes on to question the foundations of your institution and abuse people. It's perfect. Here I've got it. Mary Simon is a million times better pick than Payette was. And one of the reasons that I really liked her is because the first question she asked was about this Aboriginal stuff, and she backed down and said that she was a proud Canadian. Still though, she will be called upon to bemoan the travesty of colonialism, and while out and about enjoying the indulgences. I mean, the liberal pigs have been snorting at the trough for a long time, and that's becoming just more and more clear. So that kind of excess is torture to contemplate, especially to people who are struggling to pay for food and housing. Further torture. Without being arrested, protesters were beaten, handcuffed with no gloves, and sometimes for as much as an hour in 20 below zero temperatures. Most were delivered to remote areas of the city with dead cell batteries and no public transport. Some had their bank accounts frozen and could not leave the city. There are a lot of people who already know about all of this. Now they're seeing a clearly biased liberal media reporting on the commission, and yet still no violence. All of this taken together, especially with regard to the Emergencies Act, was meant to create a violent response that didn't come. So that tells you the nature of the protesters. They were provoked and they weren't violent. It reveals the character of the people involved in this. Probably one of the very most important events in Canadian history. Never before have Canadians needed to protest the tyranny of their own government. We need to make sure that history is written fairly. The mainstream propaganda outlets won't do it for us. Now finally we come to the conclusion. The truckers were right, and right to protest. Sorry, but for a lot of Canadians who took a disparaging attitude towards the truckers, now might be the time to show a little contrition. Few people have a positive view of politicians who demonize, intimidate, and suppress their political opponents. It is a commonplace among people who are interested in protecting democracy that governments will use crises, real or imagined, to resort to authoritarian tactics, to cement their power, frequently stomping on fundamental human rights in the process. Hopefully a lot more Canadians are becoming aware of how destructive Trudeau and his woke policies are to the fabric of the nation. The only alternative now is Pierre Poilievre. It just happens to be the way it worked out. He is the child of an unwed teenage mother, adopted by teachers towards whom he professes love. His father lives freely as a gay man. He is bilingual in French and English, and is married to a woman from Brazil. He's not the boogeyman that people make him out to be. The thing that worries me about him is the way he may not be focused on the environment as much as I would like him to be. That's my concern. The truckers, well, they invested their own money, time, energy, and resources to protest what they understood to be an increasingly authoritarian government. That much is absolutely certain. Many people would disagree with that assessment, but they thought they were fighting tyranny and deserving of a lot of gratitude and admiration, in my opinion, and in the minds of a growing number of people. The Liberals prorogued the Parliament constantly to protect parliamentarians from catching COVID. I'm sorry, I was distracted here. The Liberals prorogued the Parliament ostensibly to protect parliamentarians from catching COVID, but more likely to prevent getting caught rewarding wealthy corporate friends with CERB payments. There are billions of dollars left unaccounted for, and the Liberal government won't even inform us of who the money went to. Together with the McKinsey fiasco, perhaps, this will help more people to get back on the right side of history, as much as any of the other misdeeds documented here. People get angry as they find themselves slipping into poverty and being pushed there by people who enjoy so many extravagances. Perhaps you recall the resolution that I put forward at the beginning of this thing. Be it resolved. The truckers were right to protest the excessive mandates, lockdowns, and the increasingly woke authoritarian tendencies of the Liberal government and its paid-for media. And the mainstream educational systems that have been captured by woke ideologies for decades already. You might want to research the phrase "long march through the institutions" for reference. The invocation of the Emergencies Act was not only unjustified, but dangerous and damaging to social cohesion in Canada. Trudeau's extraordinarily rude attitude towards the truckers was intended to provoke a violent response. Not quite decided? Perhaps this bit of questioning from the committee hearing set up to study the invocation of the Emergencies Act might still persuade you. The man questioning Christy Freeland is Larry Brock, a Conservative MP. You can see the YouTube video for yourself at Christy Freeland, I'm Not Talking, on a channel called Justin Trudeau Corruption. Brock. On March 21st, the CBC, without explanation, without apology, without clarity, retracted their story regarding the funding of the protest. Were you aware of that? Freeland. I'm not speaking for the CBC. Brock. I'm not asking you to speak for the CBC. I'm asking you if you were informed that the CBC retracted the story, the false story about foreign funding donations to the convoy. Freeland. Again, Mr. Brock, I do not believe it is the CBC being interrogated. I believe it is the government. Brock. Just answer the question, Ms. Freeland. Were you aware? Yes or no? It's a simple question. Freeland. I don't have the article in front of me, and I'm not here to answer questions about the CBC. Brock. The Deputy General, the most senior cabinet minister, is not prepared to accept whether the UBC retracted a story. You relied on that story from the CBC and shared your concerns with Canadians regarding terrorism funding and money laundering. Freeland, let me be very clear. My principle when it comes to the illegal occupation and the illegal blockades is the economic harms. Brock, let me be very clear, Minister. Your words several times in the House of Commons referred to terrorism funding and money laundering. Are you saying you did not use those words? Freeland, I'm speaking here today and I'm talking about the central motivation of our seriousness. And I'm here to ask questions, and I expect, unlike question period, to receive answers. Do you recall using the words terrorism funding and money laundering in the House of Commons and in reporting outside the House of Commons? Freeland says, I believe that if we were in a court of law, this would be called badgering the witness. Another dizzy moment. She knew what Brock wanted to know. Was she aware that the CBC had retracted the story she relied on to make false allegations that the Freedom Convoy had been involved in money laundering and terrorism funding? When asked about it, she responded with an indolent attitude seemingly designed to cause as much irritation as possible, and apparently confident that she would face no consequence whatsoever because no mainstream news outlet would cover the story. Anyway, in the beginning I put forward the resolution. Be it resolved, the truckers were right to protest the excessive mandates, lockdowns, and the increasingly woke authoritarian tendencies of the Liberal government. It's bought and paid for mainstream media and mainstream educational systems that have been captured by woke ideologies for decades already. You might want to research the phrase long march through the institutions for reference. The invocation of the Emergencies Act was not only unjustified but dangerous and damaging to social cohesion in Canada. Trudeau's extraordinarily rude attitude towards the truckers was intended to provoke a violent response. Towards that end, I provided evidence of their authoritarian tendencies and corruption and included commentary from people like Douglas Murray, Tulsi Gabbard, and members of the European Parliament to that effect. It would be easy to find more. Google dictatorial Trudeau and see what you get. I went on to describe how he and the woke movement seek to create divisions across society, which they can exploit in their quest for power, and how that violates the principle of equality of opportunity. There was discussion of the enormous debt that they have left us with, and alluded to the fact that much of the borrowed debt went to Liberal friends, such as the consultancy company McKinsey, a company that has been involved in several nefarious activities, including helping the pharmaceutical company Purdue turbocharge the sale of opioids. I listed a series of embarrassments and scandals that the government was involved in, some of which, such as the SNC-Lavalin affair, alone should have brought down a government, and others that displayed an almost unimaginable contempt for our country and institutions, such as the time that the MP from Brampton, Chakat Ali, participated in the House of Commons from a bathroom stall. And apparently, the reason they knew is because that's what it sounded like. In any case, it provides one more example of the sort of absurdity we have to deal with from this government. Finally, I argued that the invocation itself was not needed because the border blockades had already been dealt with using regular police powers, and the truckers were already leaving the residential areas of Ottawa. Nor was it justified because there was no serious threat to the people of Canada, and because regular police powers were not only sufficient, but could have brought the protest to a peaceful conclusion. So, have I succeeded or not? That's up to you. I believe that I've made my case. And I had planned to wrap this up with a few more quotes from Roger Scruton, but my wife is anxious for me to go with her, and so that'll have to take place in the next installment. Thank you very much.